through the final action plan, which is essentially the last deliverable of this project, and that is actually probably be one of the most challenging in terms of try to understand what are the necessary actions so that Estonia can be put into one of the pathways, ideally on the preferred pathway, and what are different stakeholders expected to do to ensure that expected technology mix can happen. So just quickly an introduction to what I'm going to be discussing here. So the this action plan is part of deliverable 7. So looking at both the action and some indicators and other information that can allow us to understand what the action entails, for example, in terms of cost, in terms of complexity of its implementation, in terms of the different steps, and so on. Now, to arrive at this series of action, our approach has been let's try to see what stakeholders have to say about it. And as part of our interviews and as part of other tasks, such as the risk analysis, we ask stakeholders what they think should be the main actions that the government should put in place to allow this pathway to come forward. As part of this work, we also wanted to understand the why these actions were proposed. So what are the main barriers that we want to overcome to allow the desired uptake of different renewable technologies? Now, there are some limitations on this analysis. For example, the fact that we are looking at the electricity sector in isolation, and this reconnect to Kuhn's recommendation from earlier of looking at not only what can be achieved within the electricity sector, but also where the system integration comes into play. I saw that there was some questions to what extent different flexibility technologies were explored, such as hydrogen. So hydrogen was part of the demand curve, but was not explored as part of the one main flexibility options. So again, there are probably other perspectives that can be brought in when you look at different sector combined and how these can help overcome each other shortcomings. It's also important to say that the action plan is to the large extent based on the modeling results. So, and the modeling did not look at the distribution system. So in general, some reinforcement to the distribution system will be needed because of more distributed generation. But at the same time, we know that one of the main drivers of the need for reinforcement is the switch, for example, to electric heating and the coming of electric vehicles with their charging needs. So this is also something that was not part of this work. So quickly, I'm going to just go through some of the barriers that stakeholders indicated that any action should address. Any action plan should try to address. And I want to say that these are not all of them, and so I don't want to put that, let's say, undue stress only on these, but this seems to be quite recurring across stakeholders and also indicating some legendary sources, and this is why we are trying to convey them in a single message here. So that first barrier seemed to be this raised mostly by investor is the fact that while Estonia has been doing very well with several progress in terms of renewable generation and other renewable energy in general, because it's not yet clear what is the long-term strategy is, some investors are reluctant to risk their money because they may see different policy focus in the future, which means that technology that they suggest, they may face further risk in terms of market preference or so on. This lack of, let's say, this lack of clarity seems also to be one of the explanations behind the quite sustained consumer or citizen opposition to some locally based renewable generation, such as wind parks. Second key barrier seems to be the planning process. That's that process where we go from an idea for a development of a renewable site to the point where work to develop the site can actually start. And stakeholders have raised with us a number of factors that could be behind the slowness of the process and the complexity. And they say we group them here in 3 categories. So the lack of incentives and limited capacity and skills. When we say capacity, we mean simply, the physical amount of staff available, but also maybe that skills that are required are not the skills owned by some of the local administrator or administrator at a level in charge of the process. But also the supply chain itself. There is some noticeable gap in the quantity and quality of experts available, for example, related to some of the required studies or some, such as the impact assessment or some of the other, for example, legal implication or how to deal with some legal aspect of the planning process. These shortcomings are often exploited by citizens contraries to, that see these perceived negative values on the deployment of renewables, and this is a further further driver of the slow process. And this is also a main point itself. There is a not in my backyard type of approach, which is widespread because of this perceived negative impact. And quite often these few local few member local opposition are quite vocal, and because of the way the process is set up, they are able actually to slow it quite substantially. Final point concern some of the risk that investors have indicated to be, again, the second most important barrier to investment. And this is essentially related to the market risk that renewable face. Now, it's important that, to be precise on what we're talking about here. So very often the type of instruments are categorized in general as subsidies. But in this case, what is the need for the subsidy is essentially to reduce investor risk so that they will require a lower return on their investment, and this is gonna allow renewable to come in more and more competitive in price. And that type of support that they require is essentially shielding from some unexpected market swing that may see very low electricity prices for protracted long period, and being the majority of renewable sources have zero or near zero marginal cost, they have no way of modifying their operating hour to cut the cost. So essentially, because of the high share of fixed cost, they need some more guarantees that they'll be able to recover from the market compared to other sources with higher operating costs. So based on that, and based on some of the feedback received by stakeholders, we've drawn up a long list of actions, and then we've shared a few times and to look for feedback, especially from the ministry. let's say, to simplify, we grouped various actions into what we called action sets that look at specific area of the electricity market and what with different objectives for these areas. The first three are presented here. So the first concerns the planning process for infrastructure, so which is essentially that refers to the barrier that I highlighted before, to one or two barriers highlighted before, and in particular about improving the slowness and improving the unpredictability of the process. And this is especially serious for onshore wind park, but also onshore ground-mounted solar park, other renewables, and for slightly different reason, also the offshore wind is affected. In this case, is more due to national planning issues. So the let's say the action that we recommend in this respect, and is important to say, to clarify what we mean by recommend here. So we know that the majority of the issues and of the objectives that we deal with here, the ministry is well aware, the government is well aware of these challenges, and they are indeed already working on it. For example, they're already looking at the planning process and have recently already done some changes that allow a faster process. So it's important to say that the action that we recommend, they are a direction. What could be the areas where further action can be taken? And in the case of the planning process, we're looking at streamlining the process, and this is a series of, let's say, sub-actions that would give more certainty to investor on the different steps. We recommend a review of the process to see if any step can be avoided, if any step can be combined, or if to what extent can some time limit, stricter time limit, be imposed on the process. The action to looking at administrative resources, and this refers to, again, one of the barriers identified, that to speed up the planning process and increase in the number of administrators in charge, both at national and local level, could have, stakeholders believe that could have a substantial impact on the speed at which their application is processed. Other action instead is a combination, looks at a combination of aspects. For example, looks at the incentive for local administration to speed up this plan or to identify new areas to be available for renewable development. It could be to do with incentives, and we've heard earlier that there is indeed an action that looks at how to better incentivize local administration to speed up this process. Other element of the last action concern, for example, backstop measures. So when, at which point should the central government intervene and overstep some reluctance from local authorities? Or finally, another action could look at to what extent can either the ministry or someone like Ellering, which already does this as a good practice, carry out already some of the preliminary studies rather than leaving everything to the developer, so that they can reach an investment decision much faster. For example, looking at potential wind generation or a geological study on the sites and so on. So if these studies can be financed and carried out early on centrally, that would speed up the process and would incentivize wider competition. Second point concern an institutional reform. Now, it's important to note that the action that are recommended here, they they're driven mostly by what we see as good practices across other member states. And these actions, they vary according with the scenario proposed, where we see some institutions being more relevant than others. For example, we suggest the creation of an energy and climate agency, which would relieve some of the responsibilities from the ministry and allow a separation of powers and responsibility that we've seen working relatively well in many member states. So where this Energy and Climate Agency could take up a number of roles and responsibilities, but essentially could act as the main advisor to the ministry and to other stakeholders. For some scenario, there will be required specific institution. For example, in a scenario where nuclear is pursued as one of the main options, action to set up a nuclear regulator should start as soon as possible. The last point on the slide is about, let's say, risk reduction instrument. So refer again to one of the barriers identified before, which is help developer to reach investment decision faster and help lower the cost of renewable generation by reducing the required return on investment that investor may require. Now, the action recommended cover a number of points, starting from the uptake of action to stimulate the uptake of PPAs to other actions that again would tend to lower that perceived risk, such as support with guarantees or investment, direct government investment in some projects. But let's say the most consequential of the action presented here concern the extension to the current renewable options. Now we know already that two substantial options. One is already started. The next one will be completed next year. And we've been looking at what can be expected in terms of new generation being incentivized by these auctions. And we see that the amount is very short of what the scenario model required. So this is why we recommend looking again at this instrument in two ways. One is extending into further years, and two is to adapt it according to the preferred objectives and to the preferred pathway. So in a pathway such as the old technology pathway, which is built on the principle of, let's say, open and free competition across all technologies, we believe the current design is fit for purpose and in the long term would progressively incentivize the lowest cost technologies. When it comes to other scenarios where instead the focus is put on specific technologies, such as the offshore wind scenario, in this case, we recommend an approach followed by other member states where dedicated budgets within the same instrument are set for, let's say, different expensive level, different technology maturity level, and this would be able to to support that dedicated that technology required. So it's important that we also suggest, although that details should be part of a more thorough strategy, is that this the same renewable option scheme could look at supporting also the deployment of flexibility. For example, providing different rates for those installations that between they expect to build renewable generation, so intermittent generation with battery storage to to stabilize the output from the plant. I'll move to the next slide, and this is about 3 further action set. So the first one looks at what action should be dedicated for household and small to medium enterprise. So what we're looking at here is power generation, but is more geared toward self-consumption. And our recommendation in this case is to look at what essentially most member states are doing, which is to bring together any instrument to support further renewables with instruments to stimulate energy efficiency. So the moment that a new regulation establishes a limit on the energy efficiency of new houses, or there are incentives for improving, so refurbishing current housing, we know that solar panels generally are one of the more cost-effective solutions, and so this simply providing support via the schemes would indirectly support more renewable generation. So power net-owned infrastructure. Now, this was some of the more complex actions. So compared to other aspects of the action plan, let's say the approach to power network and infrastructure does not have, let's say, substantial differences across pathway. So there is an ongoing process for the Baltic state to come into the main European grid via the synchronization process, but the Baltic states already operate quite in synchrony when it comes to for example, shared markets. Now, this is where the recommendation mostly focus on, so to continue and extend this process. So looking at flexibility strategy based on the, let's say, the outcome of the model scenario gives a better idea what could be the target, what could be the expected flexibility market into the future. And based on this, looking at different instruments to ensure this capacity comes at the lowest cost. Now, according to the modeling, batteries will be one of the main drivers for the for flexibility, and this is where some further action may be developed to improve the chances of this investment happening. Last set of action set look at the involvement of the civil society. So again, we want to lower the public resistance to new infrastructure and ensure that project developers face fewer challenges when trying to set up a new project. So our recommendations verge on essentially communications, both in terms of the strategy, where is Estonia going, but also in terms of in which way this strategy and this target can benefit the household or the small shop or the small firm. For example, this could be done via one-stop shops with the main aim to guide and to help consumer navigate the challenges of the energy market, but also facilitating the active involvement of citizen and small enterprise into renewable generation projects that are deployed in the local areas. So once we arrive at the definition of this action set, the next question was, how do these actions need to be, let's say, tailored to ensure the different pathways come forward? Now, we see that most of these actions are actually relevant across all pathways. There is a good number that let's say, there is very little difference in our recommendation. We believe that is an action that is fit in all cases. While in other cases, one pathway will require a very specific approach. For example, there will be action concerning the power network and flexibility. They would be needed broadly in every scenario. That is best practice that every country, including Estonia, is naturally transitioning to. But at the same time, the strategy may be less important in a scenario with a carbon capture and storage fitted to fossil fuel plants, because that would, the flexibility that such a plant is able to provide means that there is less need to drive new investment into flexibility technologies compared to other scenarios. So looking at pathway by pathway, so RES and storage pathway. So this is the pathway with an extensive deployment of offshore wind, and that requires also a substantial amount of storage generation. I mean, at this regard, it's important to say that important steps already been made with the offshore grid. With news that by 2030 already 1 gigawatt of offshore wind may come online, which is totally in line with this scenario. So once there is the offshore grid, a developer would have a much easier path to an investment decision. In this case, the priority in action concerning the planning approvals process should give particular attention to the offshore element, obviously, and in terms of this, there may be also important steps to enable more international competition. Now, for smaller projects, it's unlikely that that there will be a long list of international competitors, but for wind, that is where lower prices can be achieved if more foreign firms are able to participate. Other technologies require, let's say, a strong level of support as well, in particular onshore wind and solar PV, which, just to give you an idea, onshore wind is deployed to their full potential by 2030. But also there is a substantial amount of solar PV being deployed. Now, this is one of the scenarios which is likely to be the most expensive, so in terms of investment required, and that may also translate in quite high electricity price. And if we look at a market instrument to help reduce the investment risk, as we suggest here, via other dedicated renewable auctions, what it means is that some consumer may be substantially affected in their energy bill, given that the support for this new generation is provided via a levy on the energy bill. So consumer support will become quite important here to avoid negative perception especially from the most vulnerable households. So the nuclear pathway. So when we look at forcing into the system a certain amount of nuclear generation. So what happened is that the way in which the model, this scenario was modeled, is that nuclear would be essentially almost a flexibility resource. And this is why in this scenario we see a huge amount of solar generation coming forward. Now, the moment that a higher load factor is imposed on the nuclear plant, so we explore the sensitivity with a 90% load factor. That has quite some effect on the on the economics of the model. For example, having big impact on the price and on the overall economic impact. Obviously, there will be a number of actions related to the nuclear energy strategy that will be necessary to develop, including some regulatory bodies, the skills, the supply chain, and so on. But also public opinion will have to be managed. It is also important, one of the recommendations concerning this scenario is that if the idea is to rely on a technology that by experience, the member state is challenging to deploy, from the point of view of timeline, but also from the point of view of the cost, is important to have, let's say, a backup plan, because given the expected timeline as modeled in the scenario of nuclear, so nuclear will not be available before the late 2030s, that would require very expensive remedial action. So essentially building a lot of additional resources, additional generation sources in a short period of time that will be quite expensive. The carbon capture and storage pathway. So obviously the key action here is the deployment of the carbon capture infrastructure that would capture, transport, and ensure the use of the technology. Now, the scenario as was modeled had several shortcomings, and they were indicated by the double minus sign and the deep red in the table. For example, looking at focusing on this technology according to the model doesn't stimulate enough investment and keeps renewable generation quite low. So as it is not a good option. However, the technology doesn't mean that technology per se is not a good option. Is that the technology to become viable needs to allow much broader investment. And this is why our recommendation in terms of action is to explore to what extent other outlets for CO2 can be found, so that the generation from CO2 from carbon capture fitted plants can increase. And also the infrastructure created can be shared, for example, with the industrial sector, and maximize the return on the investment. The renewable gas pathway, again, it looks pretty good under several indicators, but there is the let's say the counterintuitive result that sees that even though there is a big amount, is essentially 1 gigawatt of biogas generation, this actually, in terms of gigawatt hour generated and released into the system, is pretty low. So in this case, biogas would be able to offer flexibility type of support, is kind of peaking plant, but the cost is still so high that that we see very low utilization. So this is why we think this is a good scenario, is a good technology mix, but deploying so much biogas would not make sense. And given the type of technology, may also be expensive. So what are the right instruments to bring forward such a this type of capacity? This is obviously you cannot use an instrument such as the reverse auctions, because they are based on the principle of rewarding generation rather than capacity. And a capacity, one of the possible solutions will be a capacity remuneration mechanism, but to opt for such a route, there has to be a really good reason for it. This is why we think that lower investment in biogas may be preferable, and this may be stimulated through a more developed flexibility market. So the all technologies pathways, they all rely on the same, let's say, assumption of free open competition between technologies, so that the lowest cost would emerge. Now, the result of these scenarios, more than other, are very dependent on the assumption used, in particular assumption over the cost of different technologies. And we see that by changing some of the factors explored in the sensitivity analysis, such as wind availability or cost, we can see very different technologies emerging. So in some case, nuclear may emerge as competitive technology. In other case, could be carbon capture. In other case, there could be more biogas and so on. So what does it mean? In general, it means that this opting for this type of approach, which is fairly in line with the current approach, needs to, let's say, focus on creating the right market for these technologies to emerge and to compete on an equal level. And to drive the required additional deployment beyond the base case, so to achieve the additional objectives of no electricity import or 8,000 megawatt of reserve capacity, well, that would require simply a bigger share of support measure. So this support measure would be able to allow these additional technologies. Now, looking at the impact assessment, it's important to say that the support required will be more than compensated by the whole economic benefit generated by the scenario. So true, the impact on consumer would be substantial because of an increase of the environmental levy that goes to finance these support schemes. But at the same time, the market price will benefit because it could be substantially lower than in other scenarios. Also, given the, let's say, the potential upcoming of new technologies, these are the scenarios where it makes more sense to always keep other options open, such as carbon capture and storage, nuclear, or investing more in research and development, exactly because we want to try and bring forward these new technologies and see at which point they can compete and deliver generation at lower cost. Now, conclusion for this. Apologies, let me just go back to a previous slide. This is what this is essentially to going back to something that Kun showed before. So what are our general recommendations looking at this at these actions? So in general, we think that because there is not a huge difference on the majority of on that technology mix that we see across all scenarios, there are several no-regret actions that would fit in any case, and that should be started in the short term. These are actions to streamline the planning process, so which should be tailored to whether to a specific technology according to the pathway or to large scale versus smaller scale and so on. It should be the action to reduce market risk. Again, these actions should be tailored to a technology neutral approach, or they could have a more specific target in terms of which technologies we want to support and create separate budgets. I mean, here we say setup, but should be more the continuation of the expansion of the market for reserve capacity, flexibility, and ancillary services, which should be open across the Baltic and with more, with what we believe should be more granular instrument. Demand side management. So this is a measure that the model recognizes as extremely cost efficient, so is exploited to the maximum, basically in every scenario. And the action that we recommend are mostly linked to the previous action points, so the market for capacity and flexibility, yes, and the action are aimed at facilitating the participation of prosumer on the service. Similarly, action to facilitate the diffusion of PPAs, the limit of the guarantees, and to support vulnerable households. Now, these are actions that would make sense in any low carbon development scenarios, and so, yeah, again, we think that they should be taken as a priority and just in case tailored to the specific of the pathway chosen. I think this was all for me. Unless Koen, you want to add some further observation?
Thank you, Andrea. So I checked the chat, but there is a lot of echo. But basically, no, there was nothing additional. So there were some questions about the morning session still. So also Iri answered something about the modeling. But otherwise, if I look at all the chats, no, nothing additional. So I don't know if we have still 10 minutes before we're going into the next presentation. So if maybe somebody has a question directly, it's always welcome.
I can maybe reply to a question from Aino Hazar about the lowering total energy consumption. So this is one of the limitations on the scope of the study, in which the demand was the electricity demand was somehow set as one of the assumptions, and it's important to note that while the total demand for electricity increase, a good share of this demand is actually going for power to X. So, for example, to fuel switch with transport, so electric vehicles, or to the production of green hydrogen. So indeed, further reductions are possible, and this is again the recommendation to look at electricity use in combination with other sector.
Yeah, I answered the question, Andrea. So in the chat, I refer to what we have included in the business as usual scenario and what we have added in the reference scenario. So basically in the reference scenario is basically what you mentioned now. So what we have included and what we have taken as assumption and what we haven't included. So in that respect, we only took into account, if you look at energy savings, basically, and all the policies, what was in the business as usual. So everything, and that's for people who are a little bit less familiar with impact assessments. If an impact assessment is done for the European Commission, what we do take into account is basically at the moment of starting the assessment, we do take into account what has been voted in a specific country, and as such, that will be taken into account. Future policies or potential policies are at that time not taken into account. Yeah. So that's how a business is usually set up. And then for the reference scenario, and that's why we have set up a reference scenario, we have done what Andrea just explained. Yeah, so we have taken into account, for example, the switch to indeed certain alternatives, so electric transport, electric as residential space heating, some hydrogen production, and so on. Yep. So, but if there are specific questions, so of course the document that was shared with you is showing some limited actions. They are much more developed in the main report of deliverable 7. So, and like I already said this morning, it's nearly a report of 200 pages with a lot of things already highly developed, and they will be further summarized in the final report, of course. So, but there is also a chapter which is explaining basically the most important actions, overarching actions, and there is also a chapter on recommendations and conclusions where we do explain them a little bit more in depth than what you have heard from Andrea now. If there are specific questions, so I don't see anything anymore in the chat, but
yes, there is. Stanislav is asking
okay.
from the morning session, please.
CCUS
yes.
scenario.
Of the question, sorry, can I suggest that the question is tackled on the next session, because Matthew is actually going to unpack some of these, the modeling result.
Yeah.
And it would be able not only to explain the why, but also to compare on why that happened only in some year and other. And these are is driven by some of the assumption and some of the way in which different technologies were expected to come in. For example, in all scenarios, to ensure carbon neutrality, there is a certain amount of air capture which is added to the system, so which could generate negative emissions, but also could increases the total electricity demand. Yeah.
So indeed, Matthew followed up with Janus, with Jason, from SEI, who have been doing the modeling. And he can explain if there are specific questions about the pathways and the analysis, then he can answer these questions more in depth. But yeah, don't hesitate to ask questions about the overall assessment and the actions we develop, because Andrea was in charge of D7. So in that respect, we still have a couple of minutes to answer some of these questions if you have them. Maybe I can put it also here, Andrea. So there was a question that I answered. Somebody asked, why do we need an integrated approach in function of involving different ministries, involving the Ministry of Finance, involving the Prime Minister? Why is it needed, as we have already a kind of a process in Estonia that things are prepared and then approved?
Yes, I mean, so what we're talking about here is try and set the direction for the next 30 years. And we see that in some cases it would involve quite substantial amount of investment in specific generation technologies. Now, obviously, such a national effort, it required the active participation and at least the non-opposition of all the principal forces in the country. Now, while the expectation is that the market would drive most of these investment, even if by the markets we see some state-owned business involved, is always the regulatory and the policy change required. They do need a full buy-in from other ministry as well, and especially related to to one of the first barriers identified, where there is some unclarity on the strategy and what is the main road to 2050. Now, this is the moment that all the major stakeholders agree on what the direction that would, let's say, reassure citizen and reassure investor that that Estonia will stick with that direction.
Yeah. So just to add there is that we do work a lot for DG Energy, so where we are working basically for all the EU27 member states. And this is not something that is only happening in Estonia. So we see that in many member states, there is a need to develop the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans, much more in depth. That's also the advice of DG Energy and DG Klima to many member states that we do miss the developments. So it's fine to say we want to reach X, Y, Z, but it's how you want to reach it and what are going to be the costs related to these investments and who will bear them. And so what kind of incentives you are going to develop to make this happening. So the financial part of the NECPs is missing in most of the NECPs. And then, of course, when we talk about who should do what in function of investment, also in function of governance, that is often missing. And this is really something that had to be, or that should be discussed at the highest political levels, but also that there is a kind of a continuation possible. And we don't talk about only 2025 or 2030. No, we are setting up actions up to 2050, which means that there should be a wide political agreement, but also from all stakeholders in the private sector to go ahead in a certain direction. And once this government is taking a decision, it's not the aim to change it directly, totally again, when you have a new government in place. So there should be really over a long term, a kind of a way forward, which direction you want to go. And that's what we also mean with developing a strategy where all the different stakeholders should be involved. And so, but I think that's quite logic for everybody around the table here, but in practice, we see that it's not happening often. If there are no more questions, I know that basically Matthew is in, so then I want to give you the floor, Matthew. So thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. So don't hesitate to come back to us if you have more questions once you have had the time to read maybe the documents. But at least, yeah, just, yeah, like I said, all comments are more than welcome. Good. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I will just share my screen so you can see the slides that I will talk you through. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through one of the deliverables of the work. This was the sensitivity analysis that we carried out. I guess many of you are aware of the purpose of the sensitivity analysis, and that's essentially when you're looking forward into the future, you have to make assumptions about how certain things will develop, what the costs will be, what the prices will be, etc. And the idea of this task was to test some of those assumptions. Say, okay, we believe the costs will be this, for example, for biomass, but what if biomass prices were twice as high in future? What impact could that have on the pathways? Would that change the picture of the recommendations? So it's to test how robust the findings are in the case of different assumptions. Okay. It's essentially what was explained here. So yeah, this work then tested 4 different sensitivities. First one was alternate wind availability curves. So in the deliverable 3 that we produced, which did the first pathway modelling, a certain assumption was made on the availability of wind energy across the year. The curve of what was available when across all of the hours. Based on discussions with Ellering and others, we agreed to test a different wind availability curve. This provided a more granular view on wind variability. So in effect, it made the curve steeper. There were times when there were much more wind, but also times when there was much less wind. And this introduced a greater variability into all of the pathways. And I think the important thing about this first sensitivity is that the change was viewed as so in a way fundamental, and that essentially this sensitivity was likely to be much more realistic, is that the results produced for this sensitivity analysis became the base case. So they replaced the results of the D3 deliverable. These are the results that you will have seen earlier today. They're based on this sensitivity 1 exercise. So they already use the alternate wind curves. The second sensitivity we investigated was higher nuclear dispatch. So in the standard case, the electricity market model that was used did not assume particular load factors. The market was free to choose based on the marginal cost of the different generation sources at different points in time. So in the nuclear pathway, what this led to is that nuclear, it was built and from 2040 onwards was used, but because there was no imposition of preference, the load factor was around 65 to 70%. So it's quite different as to, I think, how many other nuclear plants work currently. It's understood to be a characteristic of the technology that was being modelled and selected, that it was capable to ramp up and ramp down, which is a little bit different also to the older technologies that are operating today. But is that load factor high enough to make an economic case for investors is unclear. And so we wanted to test what would be the impact if a more standard dispatch rate. So if we force that nuclear to run 90% of the time across the year, and for that electricity to be taken by the system. So we could see the impact of what that would be. The third sensitivity, we looked at higher biomass prices. So I think already since the original assumptions were set, I think there has been some increase in prices for the raw biomass materials. Whether these are temporary or longer term is unclear, but in this pathway we tested for the renewable storage pathway, what would happen if biomass prices were essentially evolved to be twice as high as in the base case. So to test what the impact of those higher prices would be. Finally, the sensitivity 4 looked at batteries and storage. These are quite crucial across almost all of the pathways. And the assumptions on battery costs, perhaps ones with some of the bigger uncertainties. So we looked at, okay, if we assumed battery costs would actually not come down as fast as anticipated, say in this case we tested if they were 2.5 times higher than expected, what would the impact be then in terms of how much batteries are installed, what changes in costs and investments would happen. But to balance against this, we also looked at what would happen if alternative storage facilities were constructed, and this was particularly the Paldiski pumped hydro facility that where some first investigations have already been carried out, and where there is the possibility to build that already, I think, before 2030. So in this scenario, we assumed that facility was also built. Okay, are there any questions on the sensitivities? I can't actually see here if anyone's raised hands or has something to ask. If not, then I can continue and talk you through the key results from each of these sensitivities.
Yeah, so Matthew, I will come in when someone is raising a hand or asking a question, okay?
Okay, great, thank you. So for the alternative wind curves, so I'm presenting here one of the main graphs. It compares the changes in capacity that were observed between what was seen originally and then what happened in each of the pathways when the alternative wind curves came into play. We did see a significant impact on the outcome. So as you may expect, when you increase the assumption of wind volatility, you need more battery capacity or other storage or dispatchable capacity to basically help the system absorb that greater volatility. So we see here, essentially the green bars. So in the reference case, we see the battery capacity by 2050 almost doubles, and that trend is evident in a lot of the pathways from the base case in D3 and the updated base case on this sensitivity. So almost all of them see an increase in battery capacity. Some of the other trends is often there's a change in the solar PV capacity. Sometimes that comes up or down. And one thing that we did notice is in this case, the no net import pathway actually installed a small unit of nuclear by 2050. So between 2014 and 2050, a 300 megawatts nuclear module was built by the model. One of the other unusual characteristics is in the renewable gas scenario. This forces 1,000 megawatt biogas capacity to be installed in the country. It's not shown here because this is capacity, but if you look at the same chart for generation, the capacity just doesn't get used. It's available as backup, so it has some impact on reducing costs, but reducing prices, but the feedstock and the cost of the generation from the biogas is too high to be used within the model. What's just happened there? Okay, sorry, my computer. Do you still see the slides? My screen just did something strange.
Yeah, everything is fine, Matthew.
Okay, then it's just on my end. Okay. We also, as part of the sensitivity, modeled the socioeconomic impacts. I think you will have heard something about them already, but we calculated the impact on GDP, and we did this in a few different ways, and also calculating the over 5-year steps what the impact on GDP would be. We broke it down into some of the impacts per sector. Similarly for employment, we also looked at disposable income and prices. I can't present all of those results here. It would be a very long presentation. But I think the key thing is that certainly GDP is a leading indicator for employment. As you would expect, if GDP goes up, employment rises in tandem. And similarly, if it reduces, then employment also reduces. What we see in this case, you'll see on the top half of the screen, the base case of what were the results originally. And this is the cumulative GDP change over the 2025 to 2050 period. So this showed in the original modelling, the res storage, res gas, and no net imports pathways delivered the highest net positive impact, so roughly 10 billion euro positive over the period, whereas the other pathways were largely neutral. Increasing the volatility and the changes that leads to in both the investments that are needed and the impact on prices has quite important impacts then on what the socioeconomic outcomes are. What we see there is due to price increases in some of the other scenarios, the benefits are reduced. So, for example, in res storage, the increased installation of battery capacity and the way that feeds through into the model increases prices. So whilst there's a lot of economic multipliers from the investments in that pathway, the actual higher prices it leads to in the market, as far as we had a proxy for those prices, reduces overall economic, basically offsets that gain from the investments. The reverse happens largely for nuclear, where in the nuclear pathway the prices remain quite low, and this has a broader economic multiplier effect. And similarly, you can see that in the old technologies pathways, they each receive a boost in this analysis. And the CCS pathway is quite a big negative. What we saw on employment was very similar effects over the period. So you would also see the highest employment gains in the nuclear, res gas, no net imports. In the nuclear sensitivity, you'll see the changes here between what is different between the two pathways in 2030, and that's these three columns. So this was the original case that we modelled. This was the one that I've just presented, the sensitivity 1, which became the new base case. And this is the sensitivity 2, which tests this new assumption on nuclear dispatch. And similarly in 2050, base sensitivity 1, sensitivity 2. You see this, the same amount of nuclear is built, but by enforcing higher dispatch, you actually don't need as much solar and battery capacity. So there is a reduction of a few gigawatts. That's 2 to 3 gigawatts less solar and battery capacity is installed in that pathway. But what we saw, and perhaps the key effect on it, was that the prices changed a lot between the sensitivity 1 and sensitivity 2 version of the nuclear pathway. And the reason for this is in the base case, the sensitivity 1 is that at times where demand was low, they would use the technologies with the lowest marginal cost, so typically renewables with zero or close to zero marginal cost. But when you enforce this 90% dispatch in those moments where demand is low, you force the model to use nuclear, not cheaper technologies, so that pushes the price up. And the effect is quite substantial. I'll show on the next slide what that means in terms of impact. So you go from this situation in the S1 case, the base, where you have a net positive impact of around 20 billion. Actually, the change in prices that enforcing this high dispatch rate reverses that. So your net impact is almost negative 10 billion. So it's a really big switch. Yeah, this price impact is quite severe. And this also translates through into employment, other economic output effects. I think the conclusion we take from this sensitivity is that enforcing a higher dispatch would not be, from a socioeconomic impact perspective, would not be a good idea. Obviously, this creates a question for those who would invest in nuclear. Is 65 or 70% load factor, as is estimated by the model, is that sufficient to generate the return on investment that you would need to make that initial investment? So That's important question, and yeah, there's a trade-off there for sure between the socioeconomics and the energy system impacts. I'll move on to the results for S3. So this was testing the impact of higher biomass prices. So these would increase twice as fast as in the base case. So you'll see in 2030, the model chooses to install less capacity. So in the base case, the energy system in Estonia is actually a small exporter of electricity in 2030, and then quite a large exporter of electricity, net exporter by 2050. But in the case of higher biomass prices, yeah, that becomes less attractive. I think in 2030 it's just below the net exporter level, and in 2050 it's quite a reduced level compared to the base pathway. You'll see the main things is a reduction in battery capacity, but also a little bit reduction in solar capacity. They're the two technologies that most sort of move in tandem. When there's changes in one, there's usually changes in the other. They complement each other. The main technologies which are actually using the biomass is the oil shale plants, which in the model are assumed to convert to biomass in the 2030s and run exclusively on biomass. And you'll see this brown area here, which is the oil shale plants. It shrinks in the sensitivity a little bit. Obviously, I think the difference between here and here, when the prices are higher in this one, is not huge, but there is a difference. Oh, but yeah, this is capacity rather than generation, but that's how it feeds through in the model. What does that mean in terms of the socioeconomic impact? The actual, by installing less capacity, and it actually leads to reduced prices, and this gives even the small changes in prices lead, compared to this almost neutral outcome in the base sensitivity 1 case, we end up with quite a large positive impact here, around 15 billion net impact when you have higher biomass prices. So in that respect, the pathway is robust to higher biomass prices. What you're likely to see is a reduction in overall capacity and export potential, but that this actually also then leads to lower prices, and that lower price effect is much more beneficial economically than otherwise. The final sensitivity that we modeled then was the higher battery cost and the installation of the Paldiski pumped hydro facility. So on the figure again, you'll see the 2030 and 2050 comparison. This is essentially the new base, the S1. And then this scenario that we model here, you see the addition of this purple block, that is the pumped hydro plant. And you'll see the decline in the green area, which is batteries, due to both additional storage capacity being available in pumped hydro, but also the increase in costs, making it less attractive to install batteries. What we see, the other change that's evident is as the batteries decline, so does the solar. So they go in tandem again. As you reduce the amount of battery storage available, then the solar PV capacity that's installed also decreases. We see this similarly by 2050, so there's the same kind of reduction in battery capacity. And you'll see some pumped hydro was already in the base case installed by 2050. But in this case where we forced the construction earlier, it's the full installation that is installed there, and the solar share is lower again. Mentioned this one leads to lower prices than the sensitivity 1 base case, and that gives the same boost in economic impact. So whilst the investments are, the total investments that are required for this pathway are very similar to the base case, because although less batteries and solar are installed, the cost of the batteries is higher, and so the investments are quite similar. But the actual decline in system price that is expected leads to a net positive effect on socioeconomic impact. So from our perspective, we see that socioeconomically there is the scenario is robust to higher battery costs, could potentially have positive impacts. And there's also an argument to be made to follow up the Paldiski pumped hydro facility to both diversify storage options and yeah. If I just summarize then some of the key conclusions. So on the wind volatility, the first sensitivities, we saw, yeah, as you would expect, greater volatility means you need more system flexibility and storage, and adding that to the system increases the amount of investments that you need to make and the costs, and that's particularly important in pathways with high renewable shares. Essentially, in the end, they all have high renewable energy shares, more than, I think, 80% in every pathway by 2050. What can we take on what it tells us what would not be a good idea? We think certainly on the socioeconomics, the CCUS pathway is not recommended. It performs poorly by almost every metric. So certainly in the way that was envisaged, it's not one that we would recommend. The nuclear pathway, and this enforced 90% dispatch from the socioeconomic perspective is also not recommended. As I showed, it has quite a drastic negative impact on outcomes, as it's likely to push up the electricity prices over the course of the year. And one of the final things in the renewable gas pathway, yeah, this modelled 1,000 megawatts of biogas capacity being installed, but essentially the model never uses this because biogas is too expensive as a feedstock to be viable. So it would not be recommended certainly to install that volume of capacity, given that costs something in the region of 2.6 billion euros. But there are cases to be made for installation of lower capacities to be supported, and that would help deal with some of the system volatilities. As I mentioned, the pumped hydro facility can help mitigate if battery costs don't develop as anticipated in that sort of downwards trend. They also help guard against other uncertainties, so that can be a good investment to follow up. And when we look across the sensitivities and the updated pathways with the curves, I think from the socioeconomic perspective, the renewables plus storage, it's expensive, but it seems to bring good benefits from both the energy and socioeconomic perspective. Essentially, the nuclear pathway, without the dispatchability requirement, performs quite well socioeconomically. I think with that pathway, the questions are much more strategic, environmental, risk-based. That's challenges that we didn't address in the socioeconomics. And then the other pathway was the no net import all technologies pathway, which had quite strong socioeconomic outcomes, but obviously there's also question marks on that. How desirable is it to aim for that? I think in the end, by 2050, apart from CCUS, every pathway does meet the domestic requirements. It's just that some do it faster. This all technologies one, and the renewable storage are the two that do that faster. They can already do that by 2030. Okay, that was my last slide on the sensitivity analysis. So I will stop there. I believe we have questions and answers.
What I propose, Matthew, is that you close maybe the slideshow and that you have a look at the chat. But I see that most of the comments coming in the chat box are related to the pathways, the scenarios. So and I see that already several has been answered by Laurie. But yeah, if people have some questions directly for Matthew, so go ahead, I would say.
Yeah, let me see. I think I see two questions in the chat. One is scenario hydrogen wasn't assessed.
Yep.
What we see on this, I think Andrea is a little bit more familiar with how this is addressed in the model, but
yeah, we discussed it already.
Oh, you already, okay.
Yeah.
I won't expand upon that. The price of biogas, I would need to look that up. I think it was coming out at something like 85 euros a megawatt hour, which was more expensive than many of the other technologies. But I can look up the full statistics on that.